The wind, a thin, persistent mourner, whipped Ilara's plain cotton dress against her trembling legs. It carried the scent of dust and the sharper, acrid smell of fear, her own, and the collective, unvoiced terror of the women huddled further back in the crowd. Men stood impassive, their faces hard as the granite cliffs that clawed at the sky above the town of Providence. Master Thorne, the banker, a man whose flesh hung loose on his frame but whose eyes were tight with a grasping anger, gestured with a jeweled hand. His voice, slick and sonorous, rolled over the assembled. She defied decency. She spurned an honest offer, a path to respectability. Such pride invites only ruin. Ilara's throat was a knot of unshed screams. His honest offer had been a demand, whispered in the dim confines of his office, smelling of stale coin and predatory intent. She had said no. A small word, barely a breath, but it had ignited this inferno. The preacher, Hollowell, a man whose piety was as starched as his collar, nodded gravely. The Lord abhors a willful heart, child. You were offered guidance, and you chose shadows. The word clung to her. She felt their cold embrace even under the harsh noon sun. Two of Thorne's men, thick-necked and brutal, gripped her arms. Their fingers bruised. She did not struggle. There was no point. The path to the precipice was short. Below, the gorge yawned, a chasm of jagged rock and whispering pines, a place where things were lost and never found. The town of Providence, perched on its high mesa, prided itself on its righteousness, its unwavering moral compass. But that compass now pointed only downwards, into the abyss. Ilara risked a glance at the faces. Some held a grim satisfaction. Others, a flicker of pity quickly extinguished. Most were simply blank, windows shuttered against any inconvenient empathy. She thought of her mother, long gone, whose hands had been kind. There were no kind hands here. Thorne stepped closer, his breath fetid. A lesson, girl. For all those who might entertain similar delusions of self-worth, he smiled then, a brief, reptilian curve of the lips. The men propelled her forward. The edge was a crumbling line of dirt and stone. The wind shrieked, trying to pull her back, or perhaps eager to claim her. She closed her eyes. Not in prayer. Prayer had fled this place long ago. She closed them against the sight of their faces, their judgment. Then, the rough hands shoved. For a moment, she was airborne, suspended between the condemning sky and the devouring earth. The wind tore the silence from her, a single, sharp gasp. The fall was a rush of air, a blurring of rock and sky, a final, cold emptiness. She did not see the figure below, a lone man, mending a stretch of barbed wire that snaked along the desolate floor of the gorge, his movements economical, precise, dictated by the absence of a left arm. Silas heard the faint shouts from above, the distorted pronouncements of Providence. He paid them little mind. The town and its doings were a distant irritation, like flies buzzing at the edge of his hearing. He'd chosen the gorge floor for his ranch precisely because it was beneath their notice, a place of scrub and stone they deemed worthless. His remaining hand, calloused and strong, twisted the wire tight. Then, a different sound. A gasp, stolen by the wind, followed by a fleeting shadow against the cliff face. He looked up, his weathered face impassive, but his one blue eye, sharp as a hawk's, narrowed. He saw the small, falling shape. A woman. White dress stark against the grey rock. There was no time for thought, only a primal instinct, perhaps a ghost of a memory, another fall, another loss, a debt unpaid. He dropped his tools, his body moving with a surprising, desperate speed. He ran, his boots kicking up dust, towards the trajectory of her descent. He knew the rocks here, the cruel angles, the unforgiving surfaces. He positioned himself, not directly beneath, but at an angle, judging the wind, the terrible arc. His good arm, corded with muscle, raised. His body braced. It was an act of madness, a fool's hope against the certainty of impact. She struck him like a fallen bird, a fragile weight that nonetheless drove the air from his lungs. His arm took the brunt, a searing pain shooting through his shoulder, his ribs protesting as they absorbed the force that should have shattered her. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and dust, her slight form sprawled atop him. For a moment, the world was only pain and the suffocating scent of earth. He lay there, gasping, the woman a dead weight. He felt for a pulse at her neck. Faint, thready, but there. Her face was pale as death, a smear of blood at her temple. Her dress was torn, exposing a thin shoulder already blooming with a dark bruise. He grunted, the sound raw in his throat. Getting to his feet was an agony. His shoulder screamed. He ignored it. He was a man accustomed to pain, a familiar companion. Gently, with his one good arm, he gathered her up. She was lighter than he'd expected, a child almost. He began the slow, arduous trek back to his cabin, a small, sturdy structure of stone and rough-hewn timber nestled against an overhang, almost invisible from above. The cabin was Spartan. A stone hearth, a simple table and chair, a narrow cot. Tools hung neatly on the walls. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and solitude. He laid her on his cot, the only soft place in the dwelling. He fetched water from the barrel, tore a strip from a clean, threadbare shirt. His movements were clumsy with one hand, but efficient. He cleaned the cut on her temple, noted the unnatural angle of her wrist. Broken. He found splints, remnants of a broken axe handle, and linen strips. Setting the bone was a grim, silent business. She didn't stir, lost in some deep well of unconsciousness. He bound it tightly. He covered her with a thick wool blanket, despite the day's residual warmth. The shock would bring a chill. He built up the fire in the hearth, the flames a small defiance against the encroaching dusk. He did not eat. He sat in the single chair, watching her, his face a mask of stoic endurance. The pain in his shoulder throbbed in time with the crackling fire. He had saved her. Why, he didn't quite know. Perhaps it was just something a man did if he still had any claim to that title. Or perhaps, in the deep quiet of his isolated life, he had simply forgotten how to let something fall without trying to catch it. Days bled into a slow, quiet rhythm. Ilara drifted in and out of consciousness, fragments of memory, sharp and terrifying, piercing the fog. The faces, Thorne's cruel smile, the preacher's solemn condemnation, the vast, swallowing emptiness of the fall. Then, unfamiliar sensations, the rough texture of a wool blanket, the coolness of water trickling past her lips, the distant, rhythmic thud of an axe. When her eyes finally focused, she saw a ceiling of dark, weathered beams. A stone wall. The scent of wood smoke. She was not in the gorge. She was alive. Fear, cold and immediate, seized her. She tried to sit up, but a bolt of pain shot through her left wrist, and a wave of dizziness forced her back down. Her wrist was splintered, bound neatly. Her dress, the one she had worn to her judgment, was gone. In its place, she wore a large, coarse linen shirt, soft from many washings. It smelled faintly of soap and the outdoors. Panic tightened her chest. Where was she? Who had done this? A shadow fell across the doorway. She flinched, her good hand flying to her throat. A man stood there, silhouetted against the light. Tall, lean, his right shoulder broader than his left. He moved with a slight, almost imperceptible imbalance. He held a wooden bowl. He didn't speak. He simply walked to the small table near her cot, placed the bowl down, and then retreated to the far side of the small cabin, where he began to sharpen a knife with slow, deliberate strokes, his back partially to her. The bowl contained a thin broth, steam rising from it, carrying the scent of herbs and cooked meat. Hunger, a raw, gnawing ache, asserted itself. She watched him, her fear warring with a desperate need. His silence was unnerving, yet it wasn't threatening. His movements were economical, his presence filling the small space without crowding it. He didn't look at her, didn't seem to expect anything. Hours passed. The sun tracked across the small window, painting shifting patterns on the wooden floor. He moved about his chores, mending a piece of leather tack, stirring the contents of a pot over the fire. He never rushed, never made a sudden movement. When he left the cabin to chop wood or tend to something outside, he left the door slightly ajar. He brought her water in a tin cup. He changed the dressing on her temple. His touch was impersonal, practical, his one hand surprisingly gentle. She remained silent, watching, her senses hyper-alert. The fear didn't leave, but it settled, became a watchful caution rather than blind panic. One morning, she woke to find her torn dress lying on the foot of the cot. It was clean, and the jagged rips had been painstakingly mended with neat, small stitches. The thread was a slightly different color from the fabric, a visible repair. A testament. She touched the mended cloth. The care in those stitches, wrought by a single, large hand, spoke more than any words could. That day, when he brought her broth, she made herself sit up. The effort left her breathless, but she managed it. She looked at him, a direct gaze. His own blue eye met hers, briefly, then flicked away. He nodded once, a curt acknowledgement, and went back to his work. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the sounds of their separate existences, slowly, cautiously, beginning to overlap. The crackle of the fire, the rasp of his knife on the sharpening stone, the soft whisper of her breathing. He left a book on the table, its cover worn, its pages softened with age. It was a collection of poems, simple and stark, about the land, the seasons, solitude. She didn't touch it for days. Then, one afternoon, when the sun slanted low and golden through the window, she picked it up. Her fingers traced the embossed title. She began to read. The words were quiet, like the man who had left them for her. The town of Providence festered with rumor. The banker, Thorne, his fury a palpable force, stoked the embers of suspicion. She was a wicked thing, he'd declare in the general store, his voice carrying to all corners. The fall should have cleansed her, but the devil protects his own. Preacher Hollowell, in his Sunday sermons, spoke of dark influences lurking in the shadowed places, of souls easily led astray, of the righteous duty to root out corruption. Silas's name, unspoken for years except in hushed tones of wary speculation, began to circulate more freely. The one-armed man from the gorge, he communes with spirits, they say. What business would he have with such a girl, unless it be unholy? Ilara heard none of this directly. Her world was the small cabin, the crackling fire, the steady, quiet presence of Silas. She was stronger now. Her wrist still ached, but the splint felt less cumbersome. She could move around the cabin, slowly, carefully. She watched Silas. She saw the effort in his every one-handed task, splitting firewood, hauling water, kneading dough for the dense, dark bread he baked in the hearth. His missing arm was not a void, but a testament to some past battle, fought and endured. There was a profound stillness about him, a rootedness that the wind against the cabin walls could not shake. One afternoon, while Silas was out checking his snares, a tremor of the old fear returned. Hoofbeats. Not Silas's steady gelding, but multiple horses, approaching fast. Her heart hammered. She shrank back from the small window, her breath catching in her throat. Silas appeared at the edge of the clearing, his rifle held loosely in his good hand. He didn't raise it, just stood there, a silent, unmoving sentinel. 3 riders emerged from the trees, Thorne, Preacher Hollowell, and the town sheriff, a man whose authority seemed borrowed from the other 2. They reined in their horses a respectful distance from Silas. Thorne's voice, oily and loud, broke the quiet. "Silas! We know you there. We've come for the girl." The harlot who defied Providence. Silas did not move, did not speak. His silence was a wall. The preacher urged his horse forward slightly. "Son, this is a matter of moral hygiene. The town is uneasy. Her presence here, with you, it is an offense." Still, Silas stood. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Silas, just tell us if she's here. No harm will come to you if you cooperate." Finally, Silas spoke. His voice was low, rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. "My land's just 2 words. But they carry the weight of bedrock, of immovable conviction." Thorne sneered. "This land abuts Providence. Her sin taints us all." He made to dismount. Silas shifted his weight, a subtle movement, but the rifle seemed to become a more prominent part of his silhouette. Trespassers, the word hung in the air, cold and sharp. Thorn paused, 1 foot out of the stirrup. He looked at Silas's face, at the unyielding set of his jaw, the flint in his eye. He looked at the rifle. He reconsidered. With a frustrated growl, he swung back into the saddle. "This isn't over, recluse. Providence will have its due." They wheeled their horses and rode away, their departing curses swallowed by the trees. Elara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Silas watched them go, then slowly lowered the rifle. He turned and walked back towards the cabin. He didn't look at Elara, didn't mention the visitors. He simply picked up his axe and resumed splitting firewood. That evening, the silence in the cabin felt different. Less about caution, more about shared space, a shared, unspoken defiance. Elara found herself mending one of Silas's worn shirts, her fingers, though still clumsy from her healing wrist, moving with a newfound purpose. Later, as the fire burned low, she saw him by the dim light, his good hand carefully shaping a small piece of wood with his knife. The next morning, a tiny, intricately carved bird sat on the window ledge beside her cot. Its lines were simple, yet it seemed almost alive, poised for flight. She picked it up, her fingers tracing its smooth contours. She looked across at Silas, who was mending a harness. He didn't meet her gaze, but a faint softening touched the corners of his mouth. He knew she had seen it. He knew she understood. The carved bird became a talisman for Elara. She kept it in the pocket of the rough linen shirt Silas had given her, it smoothed with a comforting presence against her skin. The fear, though never entirely gone, had receded, replaced by a quiet resilience she hadn't known she possessed. She began to take a more active part in the small routines of the cabin. She swept the stone floor with a makeshift broom of twigs. She learned to knead the heavy dough for their bread, her mending wrist slowly gaining strength. She washed their few dishes in the basin, the water cold against her hands. Silas accepted her help without comment, but she saw the acknowledgement in the way he left tasks for her, the way the cabin slowly transformed from his solitary refuge into their shared space. He built a second cot, rough but sturdy, placing it on the opposite side of the hearth. The first night she slept on it, the small distance felt both vast and comforting. He was a man of immense patience, his movements dictated by the limitations of his single arm, yet he accomplished more than many two-handed men. She watched him gentle a skittish foal in the small corral, his voice a low murmur, his touch firm but reassuring. She saw him mend a broken fence line with grim determination, the wire biting into his gloved hand. He was a part of this harsh, beautiful land, as weathered and enduring as the ancient pines that clung to the canyon walls. The town of Providence, however, did not forget. Their fear, fanned by Thorn's persistent malice and Hollowell's dire pronouncements, grew like a noxious weed. A child in the town fell ill with a fever, and whispers of witchcraft, of a curse emanating from the gorge, began to circulate. The failed visit had only hardened their resolve. They saw Silas not as a recluse, but as a captor, or worse, a confederate to the wickedness they imagined Elara embodied. The air grew heavier, pregnant with impending confrontation. One evening, as a storm gathered, pressing down on the gorge with an almost physical weight, Silas spoke, his voice quiet but urgent. "They will come back." Elara looked up from the sock she was darning. His face was grim in the firelight. "They will not leave it." She knew he was right. The taste of their malice was still bitter in her memory. "What will you do?" she asked, her own voice barely a whisper. He looked at her then, a long, steady gaze. "This is my home. Yours, too, if you choose it." The offer hung in the air, simple, profound. It wasn't a declaration of affection, but of shared fate, of sanctuary offered and defended. "I choose it," she said, her voice gaining a surprising firmness. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, relief, perhaps, or the faintest shadow of a smile. He nodded once. The storm broke then, rain lashing against the cabin, wind howling through the pines like a hungry wolf. Inside, the fire crackled, a small beacon of warmth and defiance. They sat in comfortable silence, the unspoken understanding between them a stronger bulwark than stone walls. The peace was fragile, a brief interlude before the inevitable. But it was a peace they had earned, a peace they would defend. The final confrontation was coming. Ilara could feel it in the charged air, in the way Silas checked his rifle more often, his gaze lingering on the tree line. She was no longer the terrified girl thrown from the cliff. She was Ilara of the gorge, her spirit mended alongside her dress, her voice waiting for its moment. And beside her stood Silas, the one-armed rancher, a man who had caught her fall and, in doing so, had perhaps saved himself as well. The quiet of the ranch was a living thing, earned. But the town silence was a coiled snake. The morning broke cold and grey, the sky a bruised purple. A stillness lay over the gorge, too quiet, the bird silent, the wind holding its breath. Silas stood by the cabin door, his rifle resting in the crook of his good arm. He hadn't slept. Ilara had watched him through the night, a sentinel outlined against the dying embers of the fire. She, too, felt the taut anticipation. She had braided her hair tightly, the simple act of preparation for battle. She wore the mended dress, a symbol of her survival, and the carved bird was nestled securely in her pocket. The sound came first as a distant murmur, then resolved into the angry grumble of many voices, the thud of feet, the jingle of harness. They were coming. Not a small deputation this time, but a mob. Silas turned, his gaze meeting Ilara's. No words were needed. He nodded towards the back of the cabin, where a loose stone in the wall concealed a small crawl space leading out to the rocks behind. A way of escape he had prepared. She shook her head. A small, definite movement. No, she said, her voice quiet but clear, the first word she had spoken to him about her own intentions. I will not hide. A flicker of surprise, then a deep understanding, softened the harsh lines of his face. He nodded slowly. Then stand with me. The mob spilled into the clearing, a dark tide of fearful, angry faces. Thorn was at their head, his features contorted with triumph. Beside him, Preacher Hollowell clutched a heavy Bible, his expression one of grim righteousness. Many carried farm tools, pitchforks, axes, heavy clubs. They looked less like neighbors and more like wolves. Silas! Thorn bellowed, his voice cracking with malice. Your time is up. Bring out the witch. Providence demands justice. Silas stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Ilara. He didn't raise his rifle, but his presence was a clear boundary. There is no witch here, he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. Only a woman you wronged lies, screamed a woman from the crowd, her face pinched with fear. She cursed my child. My boy is sick because of her? Preacher Hollowell raised his Bible. The wages of sin are death. She consorts with darkness, and you, Silas, you shelter it. You are both an abomination. Ilara felt a surge of cold anger, but also a strange calm. The fear was still there, a tremor deep inside, but it no longer controlled her. She stepped out from behind Silas, moving to stand beside him. A gasp went through the crowd. Some crossed themselves. Thorn's eyes widened, then narrowed into slits of hatred. So, the creature shows herself. Ready to face your judgment. Ilara looked directly at Thorn, then let her gaze sweep across the hostile faces before her. She remembered their expressions as she fell. She remembered the silence of their complicity. Her voice, when it came, was stronger than she expected, resonant with a truth long suppressed. My judgment, she said, her voice cutting through the tense air. The only judgment I faced was yours, Master Thorn. Your honorable offer are made in the dark. Your threats when I refused your advances. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some looked at Thorn with new speculation. His face flushed a dark red. Slander. She lies to save her wicked skin. Do I? Ilara continued, her voice gaining power. Ask him about the ledger he keeps, the one with names of girls whose fathers owed him money. Ask him about the positions he offered them. Was that honor, Preacher Hollowell? Or was it something darker, something you chose not to see? Preacher Hollowell faltered, his grip tightening on the Bible. Some in the crowd shifted uneasily, looking away from Elara, away from Thorn. The banker sputtered, "She is mad. A desperate, lying whore." Silas took a slow, deliberate step forward. His one eye, cold as glacial ice, fixed on Thorn. "You will not call her that again." The menace in his quiet voice was more potent than any shout. The crowd instinctively drew back. The conviction that had fueled their righteous anger began to waver, replaced by doubt, by a dawning unease. Elara pressed her advantage. "I was thrown from that cliff because I said no to a powerful man. Because this town valued his wealth over a woman's word. I survived because another man, a stranger, showed me kindness when you showed me only condemnation." She looked at the woman who had accused her of cursing her child. "Your son is sick, and I grieve for that. But my survival is not a curse upon him. Perhaps the sickness lies in the fear that lets you believe such things, that lets you be led by men like Thorn." The mob was no longer a single entity. It was a collection of individuals, their faces showing a mixture of confusion, shame, and lingering fear. Some began to lower their makeshift weapons. Thorn, seeing his power slip, grew desperate. "She's twisting words. Seize her." But no one moved. His command, once absolute, now fell flat. Preacher Hollowell looked from Thorn to Elara, then down at his Bible, as if searching for an answer that was no longer clear. Silas remained watchful, a silent guardian. The standoff stretched. Then, from the back of the crowd, a farmer, a man known for his quiet sense, spoke. Maybe we've been hasty. Maybe we should hear more." Thorn rounded on him, but his bluster was gone, replaced by a desperate snarl. It was too late. The spell was broken. Slowly, in twos and threes, the people began to turn away. Not in defeat, perhaps, but in uncertainty, in a dawning, uncomfortable awareness. They dispersed, melting back into the trees, their righteous fury dissipated like morning mist. Thorn and Preacher Hollowell were left standing almost alone, their authority shattered. Thorn glared at Elara and Silas, his face a mask of impotent rage, then spun on his heel and stalked away. Hollowell lingered a moment longer, then, without a word, followed. Elara let out a long, shaky breath. It was over. For now. Silas lowered his rifle. He looked at Elara, a profound respect in his gaze. "You found your voice," he said softly. She touched the carved bird in her pocket. "You helped me find it." They stood together in the quiet clearing, the scent of pine and damp earth replacing the acrid smell of the mob. The ranch, their sanctuary, felt truly their own. The town of Providence would whisper, would watch, but they would not soon come again with torches and righteous fury. A new peace settled over the gorge, a defiant peace, earned in the face of judgment, built on courage and quiet acts of kindness. In the small cabin, 2 bowls were set on the table, 2 cups beside them. The fire burned bright, a steady flame against the vast, listening wilderness. They had faced the darkness, within and without, and had chosen the light. Their found family, forged in trauma and trust, was unbreakable. The wind still sang through the pines, but now, it sounded less like a mourner, and more like a lullaby. If you were moved by Elara and Silas's story of courage and resilience, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more inspirational narratives. We'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What part of their journey resonated with you the most? Your engagement helps us bring more stories like this to light. Thank you for watching.